She didn't arrive the way a bride was supposed to. No clean dress, no nervous smile, no careful words rehearsed on the long ride over. Adeline Mercer arrived in Lord's Gate face down against the stage window, burning alive from the inside. 3 weeks of fever and bad water and worse roads having stripped away everything except the stubborn fact that her heart was still beating. The town she'd crossed half a continent to reach looked up at the stagecoach with suspicious eyes, and the man waiting at the edge of the street, the man whose name she'd written letters to, whose photograph she'd studied until she'd memorized the set of his jaw, didn't know yet that the woman he'd agreed to marry might not survive the afternoon. If you've ever made a decision that changed everything and had no idea it was happening at the time, then you already know how this story begins. Welcome. Stay until the end, because what Adeline and Gideon built out here in the dust and the heat and the heartbreak of New Mexico is something nobody saw coming. If this story finds you, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to know how far it's traveled. Like the video. You'll want to see what happens next. The advertisement had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft. The paper worn thin at the corners from Adeline's fingers, working over it in the dark. Rancher, New Mexico territory. Seeks capable woman, unmarried, sound of health, and serious of purpose. Willing to work. Must understand that frontier life offers difficulty before comfort. Honest correspondence only. Write to G. Hale, Lord's Gate, NM. Capable. Sound of health. She'd been neither of those things when she'd written back, but she hadn't said so. What she'd said was that she was 26 years old, that she'd kept books for her father's textile warehouse for 4 years before it closed, that she could cook and mend and manage a household, and that she understood hardship because she'd been living inside it for the better part of 2 years. All of that was true. What she hadn't mentioned was the warehouse fire that had taken her father and mother both on the same February night, leaving her with a rented room in Philadelphia, $43, and a future that looked less like a road and more like a wall. Gideon Hale had written back within 3 weeks. His letter was short, shorter than she'd expected, the handwriting blocky and careful like a man who'd taught himself and never quite trusted it. He said he appreciated her directness. He said the ranch needed someone who could think clearly, not just someone who looked right at the church door. He said if she was serious, she should come in late spring when the worst of the past weather was done. She'd written back, "I'm serious," and then she'd spent 6 weeks trying to become the woman she'd described on paper. The sickness had started somewhere in Missouri, or maybe it had started before that. Maybe it had been waiting in her since the warehouse, since the funeral. Since the months of eating less than she should have, and sleeping badly, and working for a seamstress on Chestnut Street who paid her barely enough to keep the room. Maybe her body had simply been holding on until it had a reason to let go. And the moment she'd climbed onto that first westbound coach and thought, "It's done, I'm going," maybe that was when everything she'd been clenching unclenched. Whatever the cause, by the time the stage rolled through the Kansas prairie, she was running a fever. And by the time it crossed into the territory, she was the kind of sick that made the other passengers lean toward their windows and pretend not to notice. There had been a woman named Mrs. Dorothea Crane, heavy-set, traveling to visit a daughter in Santa Fe, who had pressed a damp cloth against Adeline's forehead for 2 days without being asked. Adeline had been too sick to do more than grip her hand and try to hold water down. "You got someone waiting?" Mrs. Crane had asked on the second night, when the fever spiked and Adeline had come half awake and frightened. "A man," Adeline had managed. "A rancher. In Lord's Gate." "He know you're like this?" "No." Mrs. Crane had been quiet a moment. "Well, men out here, they see a sick woman on their doorstep. Some of them step back. Some of them step forward." She'd wrung out the cloth and laid it back against Adeline's forehead. "Hope yours is the second kind." Adeline had thought about that for 3 more days of bad roads and worse heat, and she hadn't been able to figure out the odds either way. Lord's Gate was not what she'd imagined. She'd imagined something rough but real. She'd read enough about frontier towns to know not to expect cobblestones, but what she hadn't expected was how alive it felt, even through the haze of fever. One main street of beaten dirt, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, lined on both sides with wood front buildings that looked like they'd been hammered up in a hurry and then simply refused to fall down. A mercantile. A post office with a hand-painted sign, a livery at the far end with horses standing 3 deep in the corral, a saloon that was already open at midday, the sound of it drifting out into the street even through the closed window of the coach. People stopped what they were doing when the stage came in. That was the thing she noticed, even half delirious. They stopped. Men at the livery looked up from what they were doing. A woman sweeping a boardwalk paused with the broom in both hands. 2 boys who'd been chasing something in the dust between the buildings froze to watch. A stagecoach arriving in a town this size was an event. Adeline gripped the window frame and tried to make herself sit upright. She'd washed her face that morning with the last of her water, had done what she could with her hair, had changed into the least wrinkled of her 2 remaining clean shirtwaists. She was going to step off this coach looking like a woman who'd made a reasonable decision and arrived to stand behind it. That was the plan. What happened was, the door opened, the step unfolded, the driver said something she didn't catch because the ground was moving in a slow, nauseating circle, and then her foot found the step and her knee simply buckled. She went down. Not all the way. She caught the door frame, got one hand on it, swung sideways instead of straight down. But the embarrassment of it was immediate and complete. The kind of thing you feel even when you're sick, even when you're barely conscious, that hot-faced certainty that everyone is looking. They were looking. And one of them moved. She didn't see him coming. She was too busy concentrating on the problem of standing up, on convincing her legs that this was something they were still capable of. What she felt was a hand on her arm, not grabbing, not yanking, just there, steady and sure, catching her weight before she hit the dirt. Whoa. Hey, I've got you. She managed to get her feet under her enough to stand, but standing wasn't really the right word for what she was doing. Leaning was closer to it. She was leaning against a wall that turned out to be a person, her hand fisted in the sleeve of a work shirt, her face turned away because she needed a second before she could meet anyone's eyes. Adeline Mercer? She raised her head. He was taller than the photograph had suggested, or maybe it was just that she was smaller right now than she usually was. Dark hair, weathered skin, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something unyielding. His eyes were the gray-green of sage after a rainstorm, and they were looking at her with an expression that wasn't quite alarm and wasn't quite pity, something more measured than either. "That's me," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she'd intended. Gideon Hale looked at her for a long moment. Whatever calculation he was running behind those eyes, she couldn't read it. Then he said, "Can you walk?" "Yes." She tried to prove it by shifting her weight and immediately knew she'd been wrong. He caught her before she went down a second time, and then, without asking, without explaining, without making a speech about it, he lifted her, one arm behind her knees, one at her back, and started walking. "My trunk," she managed. "I'll send someone back for it." "I can walk. I just need a minute." "You can walk when you don't have a fever of about 103, he said. His voice was level, not unkind, the tone of a man who'd made a decision and wasn't interested in arguing about it. She heard the whispers at the edge of her awareness. Not quite words, just the specific sound of a town observing something it would talk about later. She closed her eyes and let herself be carried, because there was nothing else she could do, and because even through the humiliation of it, she could feel that his arms were absolutely steady, and that was more than she'd had in months. The house was not what she'd expected either, though at this point she was reconsidering everything she'd expected about anything. She'd thought, a rancher's house. She'd pictured something functional, 4 walls, a roof, maybe a covered porch. What Gideon Hale had built was solidly, carefully constructed. Not fancy, not decorated, but intentional. The kind of house where every board had been placed with thought. A wide front porch, 2 front windows with actual glass, a door that hung plumb and swung on quiet hinges. Inside, a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen at the back, a narrow staircase. Floors swept clean, which she noticed even in her state. A table with 4 chairs, one with a small nick in the back rung where someone had knocked it against something. A bookshelf with maybe a dozen books and a folded newspaper on top. He carried her up the stairs. "I don't need," she started. "You need a bed," he said. "That's what you need." The room at the top of the stairs was small and spare. A bed with a plain headboard, a dresser, a window that looked out over the back of the property. A quilt folded at the foot of the bed, blue and white in a pattern she didn't know the name of. He set her down on the edge of the mattress. She sat there, hands in her lap, trying to organize her thoughts into something resembling a sentence. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "This isn't—" She stopped. "I know this isn't what you were expecting." Gideon Hale pulled the straight-back chair from the corner and sat down across from her. His hands rested on his knees. He wasn't hovering, wasn't looming. He was just sitting, the way a man sits when he's decided to have a conversation. "How long have you been sick?" "Since Missouri. Maybe before." "You should have sent word." "I know." She met his eyes. "I was afraid you'd tell me not to come." He didn't answer that right away. Just looked at her with that unreadable expression. "You made it this far," he said at last. "That's something." "I can still work," she said. "Once I'm better. I can manage the books, keep the accounts, help with— I'm not trying to be a burden to you." "I didn't say you were." "No, but—" "Adeline." He said her name with a certain finality, the way you say a word when you want to stop a sentence from going further. "There's a woman in town, Mrs. Emery, who I'll ask to come out and sit with you. Meantime, you need water and you need to sleep. Everything else can wait." She wanted to argue. She could feel the argument forming, some version of "I can manage, I don't need tending, I'll be fine in the morning." All the things she'd been saying to herself for months, all the ways she'd been performing capabilities she wasn't sure she had. Instead, she said, "All right." He nodded, stood, started for the door, then paused without turning around. "Your letters were good," he said, straight to the point. I appreciated that. It was such an odd thing to say in that moment that she almost laughed. "Thank you." "Rest," he said, and went downstairs. Yes, the fever broke on the fourth night. She knew it because she woke up at some hour past midnight and realized she was cold instead of burning, shivering under the quilt rather than pushing it off. Her nightgown was damp with sweat, her hair stuck to her neck, and she felt hollowed out, scraped clean, the way you feel on the other side of something bad. Not well, exactly, but through. For a few minutes, she just lay there looking at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Through the window, she could see a strip of sky that was fully dark and thick with stars. More stars than she'd ever seen in Philadelphia. More than she'd imagined possible. She thought, "I'm still here." It felt like the smallest kind of victory, and also somehow like the only kind that mattered. Chuck. In those 4 days, she'd been mostly unaware of the world outside the room. But as she surfaced from the fever in pieces, an hour of consciousness here, an hour there, she'd gathered impressions. Mrs. Emery had come. A compact, brisk woman in her 50s with gray hair and a practical manner who'd brought broth and cool water and hadn't wasted words. She'd changed the cloths on Adeline's forehead with the efficiency of someone who'd done it many times. Gideon had come too. That was the thing she hadn't expected, the thing she kept snagging on in her feverish half-awareness. He hadn't kept his distance. He'd come up those stairs more than once. She'd heard him on the landing, heard him asking Mrs. Emery questions in a low voice. And twice she'd woken to find him in the chair, not asleep, just sitting there in the dark. The first time she'd seen him, she'd thought she was dreaming. "You don't have to stay," she'd said. "I know," he'd said. She'd gone back under before she could think about what that meant. The second time she'd been more alert. It was daytime, afternoon by the light, and he'd been there with a cup of water and the expression of a man who'd gotten less sleep than he needed. "The ranch," she'd said. "You're losing time." "Nothing that can't be caught up." "Gideon?" "Drink the water, Adeline." She'd drunk the water. On the fifth morning, she came downstairs on her own. She went slowly, one hand on the wall, taking her time. Her legs were unsteady and she knew she looked terrible. She'd seen herself in the small mirror on the dresser and winced at the paleness of her face, the shadows under her eyes, the way her shirtwaist hung on her as if she'd lost weight she hadn't had to spare. The kitchen was empty, but there was coffee on the stove, still hot. She poured herself a cup and sat at the table and just breathed, taking in the room properly for the first time. The kitchen was functional and well-stocked, the shelves organized in a way that suggested someone paid attention to these things. A cast-iron skillet on the stove's back burner. A row of jars. dried beans, flour, cornmeal, in descending size along one shelf. A window above the dry sink that looked out onto the back of the property, past the kitchen garden to where the land opened up. She was looking out that window when Gideon came through the back door. He stopped when he saw her. There was dirt on his boots and his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and he looked like a man who'd already put in half a morning's work, which he probably had. "You're up," he said. "I'm up," she agreed. He came in and got himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. He didn't make it a thing. The fact that she was upright and at his kitchen table, didn't fuss over her or ask a string of "how are you" questions. Just stood there drinking coffee like this was an ordinary morning. "How do you take yours?" she asked, because she was looking at the plain black in her cup and realizing she hadn't thought to ask. "Black's fine." "Good." She looked down at her coffee. "Because I didn't think to ask before I poured." Something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the proximity of one. She said, "I owe you an honest account of myself." "You don't owe me anything." "Gideon." She used his name the way he'd used hers, firmly. "Please." He looked at her for a moment, then pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She told him about the warehouse, about the fire, about the months afterward, the room on Chestnut Street, the seamstress, the $43. She told him she'd read his advertisement 6 times before answering it, and that she'd answered it not because she was foolish about what it meant, but because she'd run the numbers on every other option she had, and they'd all come out wrong. She told him that she'd meant everything she'd written, the bookkeeping, the capability, the willingness to work, but that she'd been sick when she wrote it, and sicker when she got on the coach and had spent the whole journey being afraid she'd be turned away at the door. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "My father lost the original ranch in '71, he said finally. "Drought and bad loans. I was 14. We spent 3 years working other men's land before I had enough to try again. First 2 years here, I nearly lost it twice." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I'm not telling you that to compare. I'm telling you because the people who think this territory tests you are right. It does, constantly. So the people who make it aren't the ones who never struggled." She looked at him across the table. This man she'd written letters to and thought she'd known, and now was realizing she'd only barely begun to understand. "I want to be useful," she said. "I'm not looking for someone to take care of me." "I know." "How do you know?" "You've spent a week nursing me." "Because," he said, "in 4 days of fever, every time you woke up, the first thing you said wasn't about yourself. You asked about the ranch." The corner of his mouth moved again. "That tells me something." The town of Lordsgate, as Adeline discovered once she was well enough to go into it, had opinions. Frontier towns always did. They were small enough that everyone knew each other's business and isolated enough that they'd develop strong views about how that business should be conducted. She'd understood this in the abstract. Living inside it was different. She went in with Gideon for supplies the second week after her arrival, still pale but steady on her feet, and she felt the looks in a way she hadn't the day she'd arrived because she'd been too sick to notice then. Now she noticed. The man at the mercantile, whose name was Haskell, was friendly enough on the surface, showed her where things were, answered her questions, made the right kind of conversation. But she caught him trading a glance with another man near the back of the store. Just a flicker, one eyebrow up, a small smile at one side of his mouth. A private editorial she hadn't been meant to see. At the post office, a woman named Mrs. Bellingham was less subtle. She was 50 or so, the postmaster's wife, solid in the way of someone who'd made herself a fixed point of her community. "So you're the one Gideon sent for?" she said. It wasn't hostile exactly, more like she was verifying a piece of information she'd already formed an opinion about. "That's right," Adeline said. "Heard you arrived poorly." "I did. I'm better now." Mrs. Bellingham looked at her in the manner of a woman assessing livestock. "You're from the East." "Philadelphia." "You'll find things different here." "I expect so." "I hope, Mrs." Bellingham said in the tone of someone who didn't particularly expect their hope to be fulfilled, "that you're made of sturdier stuff than you look." Adeline held the woman's gaze. "I hope so too," she said pleasantly. "Thank you for your concern." Mrs. Bellingham blinked, slightly wrong-footed, and Adeline moved on. Ici. Gideon had 3 full-time ranch hands and hired seasonal labor through Roundup. The hands were Teofilo Cruz, who'd been with Gideon the longest and had the quiet authority of a man who'd earned his place. Owen Harker, 22 and still finding his feet, enthusiastic in the way of someone who'd been told he was good at something and was trying to live up to it. And August Willard, 40-something, taciturn, whose conversation consisted mostly of single syllables but whose work, Gideon said, was flawless. She met them that first week, briefly, as she was still getting her strength back. They'd been polite in the way men are polite around someone they haven't figured out yet. Not unfriendly, just waiting. Teofilo was the one who spoke first. That first evening, she came out to the porch while Gideon was doing the last of the day's work. "You feeling better, Miss Mercer?" "Much better, thank you." She sat in one of the 2 porch chairs, breathing the evening air, which was cooler than the day had promised. "How long have you been here?" 7 years, Teofilo said. He was cleaning his saddle on the rail, working oil into the leather. Since Gideon was getting the place onto its feet. "Is that when it was hard?" He looked at her sideways. "It's always hard," he said, not unkindly. "Just different kinds of hard." The woman's name was Frances Aldrich. Adeline learned about her in pieces, the way you learn about anything in a town like Lordsgate, through fragments, through the way people moved around the subject, through what wasn't said. Frances Aldrich was the daughter of Leonard Aldrich, who owned the second-largest cattle operation in the territory, maybe the largest now that his eastern buyers had consolidated. She was 23, striking in a way that immediately made other women aware of the hierarchy it implied. And she had apparently been observing Gideon Hale's situation with careful interest for some time before an Eastern bride had materialized and complicated it. Adeline met her 3 weeks after her arrival at a gathering at the Bellingham house, a Sunday social that everyone in a 20-mile radius apparently attended, and from which Adeline understood that declining would be interpreted as a statement she wasn't ready to make. Frances Aldrich arrived in a dress that was practical enough for the territory, but cut well enough to remind you that practicality and elegance weren't mutually exclusive. She was polite to Adeline in the manner of a chess player being polite to an opponent, measuring, careful, giving nothing away. "I heard about your journey," Frances said. She was standing near the window holding a glass of lemonade, and her voice was clear and carrying in a way that made Adeline aware of the other women in the room. "How difficult it must have been, traveling so far, and then to be ill when you arrived." "It was difficult," Adeline said, "but it worked out." "Gideon was so devoted in caring for you," Frances said, with a particular emphasis on the word devoted that was too slight to call out and too deliberate to ignore. "He's a very loyal man when he's committed to something." "Yes," Adeline said. "I found that. I do hope you fully recovered." Frances's smile was practiced and perfectly positioned. The territory can be unforgiving to women who are delicate. Adeline looked at her steadily. "I'm not delicate," she said. "I was sick. There's a difference." Frances's smile didn't waver. "Of course." That evening, walking back to the wagon while Gideon talked with a group of men near the fence, Adeline turned what had happened over in her mind. Frances Aldrich was not a fool. She'd made her meaning clear without making herself the villain, which was a skill Adeline recognized and respected, even while she understood it was being aimed at her. The question wasn't whether Frances was a problem. She was. The question was what kind. When Gideon came to the wagon and they started the drive back, the night coming down around them with a sudden desert completeness, darkness and stars, no gradual fade, like back east, she thought about what she'd said to him that morning in the kitchen. "I want to be useful." She still meant it. But she was beginning to understand that useful in this territory meant something more complicated than bookkeeping. It meant learning who held power, who resented it, who was watching and for what reason. It meant understanding the geography of the place, not just the land but the human part of it, the way loyalties were mapped. She hadn't come this far to be managed or edged out. She'd come to build something. "Tell me about the books," she said to Gideon, who had been quiet beside her for the better part of a mile. He glanced at her. "What books?" "The ranch ledgers, the accounts. Who keeps them now?" "I do. Mostly in my head, some of it written. I'm not bad at the math, but I never had much patience for writing things down." "Can I look at them?" He was quiet for a moment. The wagon rolled on, the horse steady in the traces. "What would you be looking for?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's what I'd need to figure out." He handed her the reins, an odd gesture, spontaneous, like he'd decided something, and reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper covered in figures. "That's the last month's rough count," he said, from memory. She took it and held it up to the last light. The figures were clear enough, the hand that wrote them uneven but legible. "You're losing more than you need to on the cattle drives," she said after a moment. "How do you know that? You've been looking at it for 30 seconds. "The toll at the junction road," she said, pointing at a line. "This amount." "Is that per head or flat?" He frowned. "Flat. Why?" "Because if you're running more than—" She looked at the herd numbers, counted quickly. "More than 60 head at a time, the per head rate at the south route works out lower, even with the extra day's drive." Gideon turned to look at her properly. "That's true," he said. "How did you see that?" "It's what I did," she said simply, "for 4 years." The wagon rolled on. Somewhere ahead of them, the ranch lights were just beginning to be visible in the dark. "All right," Gideon said, and something in his voice had shifted. Not dramatically. He wasn't a dramatic man, but it was there. "Come Monday, I'll show you everything." She folded the paper carefully along its existing creases and held it out to him. He took it and tucked it back in his pocket. Above them, the desert stars were so dense they looked solid, and the night air was cooling fast, and Lord's Gate was behind them and the ranch was ahead. And Adeline Mercer, who had arrived barely alive and been told in various ways that she didn't quite belong here, leaned back in the wagon seat and let herself exhale, slowly, all the way. She was still here. She was going to work with that. Monday came with a hard wind off the mesa and a sky the color of hammered tin, and Gideon spread the ranch ledgers across the kitchen table like a man laying out evidence in a case he wasn't sure he could win. There were 3 of them, actual bound ledgers, not just the loose sheets she'd expected. The oldest went back 6 years, the entries in Gideon's careful, self-taught hand, figures lined up with the kind of discipline that came from someone who understood that numbers mattered even if the writing of them didn't come naturally. The newer ones were fuller, messier in places, the margins sometimes used for quick calculations that hadn't made it into the official columns. Adeline sat across from him and opened the oldest one first. She didn't say anything for a long time. Gideon poured himself coffee and stood near the window and let her work, which she appreciated. Some men would have hovered, would have started explaining things before she'd had a chance to see them for herself. He just stood there drinking coffee and looking out at the wind pulling dust off the corrals. "You've been running the cattle to market through the Aldrich Junction?" she said, without looking up. "It's the shortest route." "I know. But Aldrich charges a premium for non-affiliated drives. It's in the 3rd column here, buried under the general transport costs." She ran her finger along the figures. "You're paying an extra 11 cents per head that you wouldn't pay on the south route, even accounting for the extra day and the water costs." Gideon turned from the window. "That's how much over a full drive?" "Depends on herd size." "On your last 3 drives?" She did the math quickly in her head, cross-referenced the herd numbers, and told him. He set the coffee cup down. "That's not nothing." "No?" she said. "It's not." He came to the table and looked over her shoulder at the column she was pointing to. She was aware of him behind her, the size of him, the particular way he occupied space, and she kept her attention on the numbers because that was what this was. This was business. This was what she'd come to do. "The Aldrich connection goes back a ways," he said slowly. "I drove through his land when I was first establishing the route, and we had an understanding." "Is that understanding still in place?" A pause. "Less than it was." She looked up at him then. He was close enough that she had to angle her head back to meet his eyes. He stepped back slightly and pulled out the chair beside her. "Francis," he said, "I didn't ask." "You didn't have to." He sat down. Leonard Aldrich made it known, a couple years back, that he wouldn't mind an arrangement between his operation and mine. She's his business logic as much as she's his daughter, and I never said no directly, but I never said yes either, and after a while the silence got its own weight. Adeline thought about the Sunday social, Francis Aldrich's careful, precise pleasantness. He's a very loyal man when he's committed to something. So using his road is something you've been doing because stopping would be a declaration, she said. Something like that. And what would he do if you switched routes? Gideon turned the coffee cup in his hands. It was a thing he did when he was thinking. She'd noticed it before. Leonard Aldrich doesn't hold grudges openly, he said. He's smarter than that. But he has friends on the water board, and there's a grazing rights dispute with my eastern parcel that's been quiet for 2 years. It could become loud. Adeline absorbed this. The numbers were the easy part. They always were. The numbers just sat there and told the truth. It was everything wrapped around the numbers that got complicated. All right, she said, show me the grazing rights situation. He looked at her for a second, something shifting in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like a recalibration. Like he'd expected her to stop at the ledgers and was adjusting to the fact that she wasn't. It's not in the books, he said. It's in a file in the other room. Then let's start there, she said, and come back to the books. They worked for most of the morning. Teofilo put his head in around 10, saw what was spread across the table, and removed it again without a word. Owen came looking for Gideon about a fence line issue and was told to make a decision and then come tell him what he'd decided. August didn't come at all, which was apparently standard for August. What emerged over the course of those hours was a picture more complex than the individual ledgers had suggested. The ranch was profitable, genuinely, solidly profitable. But it was also carrying inefficiencies that had accumulated over years of being managed by a man who was excellent at cattle and land and not particularly systematic about the record-keeping around it. Not careless, just not built for it. Some of the costs Gideon had accepted as fixed were negotiable. Some of the roots and relationships that structured the operation had been established in different circumstances and hadn't been revisited. Adeline made a list. Not on the ledger, in a small notebook she'd brought from Philadelphia, one of 3 she'd packed because she'd known, even before she left, that she was going to need to write things down. You write fast, Gideon observed at one point. I think fast, she said. I've learned to keep up with myself. She said it without thinking, and there was a moment where it could have gone strange, where it might have sounded like boasting, but he just nodded as if that was a reasonable thing for a person to be. By noon, she had 4 pages of notes and 3 questions she needed more information to answer, and Gideon got up and made sandwiches from yesterday's bread and some cold beef from the icebox, which she ate without ceremony because she was hungry and because it seemed like exactly the right moment to not make anything of it. My father would have hired someone for this, Gideon said after a while. He was looking at her notebook. If he'd had the money. He always said the books were the thing that got men like us. He meant ranchers. Men who learned by doing. He said the books were where we lost. He wasn't wrong, Adeline said. I saw it in my father's warehouse, too. Men who built something real and then couldn't track what it was doing. What was it like? The warehouse. She hadn't talked about it much since the kitchen that first morning. She thought about how to answer. Not whether to, but how. Big, she said. Loud. Full of men who talked over each other all day and then were surprised when things got confused. She paused. My father let me keep the books because I asked to and because I was cheaper than hiring someone, and then after about a year he stopped checking my work because it was always right. That must have been satisfying. It was. She looked down at the notebook. I was good at something that mattered? That's all you really want, isn't it? To be good at something that matters. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. That's about it. Got it. The letter from Philadelphia arrived on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of Adeline's time at the ranch, and it was from her Aunt Clara, her mother's sister, the only family she had left. And it said, among other things, that Adeline had made a reckless decision and that she hoped the man was decent and that she, Clara, had prayed for her. And at the very end, almost as an afterthought, your father would have worried, but he also would have understood. She read it twice sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, then folded it along its crease and held it in her lap. She hadn't let herself think much about her father since leaving Philadelphia. There was a version of grief that you could keep at a distance by staying in motion, and she'd been doing that. The packing, the traveling, the sickness, the recovery, the work. But her father had always said she was more like him than her mother, and sitting on Gideon Hale's porch, looking out at this flat, enormous, indifferent land, she thought that was probably right. He'd have sat here too. He'd have looked at the horizon and started doing math. She was still sitting there when Gideon came up from the barn. He stopped when he saw her face. She didn't know what was on it exactly, but something, and didn't come up on the porch immediately. Something wrong? Letter from my aunt. Bad news? No. She folded the letter smaller. Not bad news, she worries. He came up the porch steps and took the other chair. And for a while neither of them said anything, which she was beginning to understand was something he was comfortable with. Silence didn't seem to make him anxious the way it made some people anxious. Did you have family here? She asked. Before? Anyone who came with you? My mother, he said. She came the first year, when I was trying to get the place established. She stayed 2 seasons and then went back to Missouri because the winters were too hard on her joints. A pause. She died in '82. I didn't make it back in time. I'm sorry. I've made my peace with it. He said it the way people say things they've said before, testing whether it was still true. She knew what she raised. She wasn't surprised by the choices I made. Adeline looked at the horizon, which was going gold and amber at the edges as the sun worked its way down. My mother thought I was practical to a fault, she said. She meant it as a criticism, I think. She thought I should want things that were less calculated. What kind of things? Romance, I suppose. The idea of it. She almost smiled. She would have read that advertisement and thought it was the saddest thing she'd ever seen. And what did you think? I thought it was honest, she said, and I'd had enough of things that weren't. He looked at her sideways. The light was doing something particular to the dust in the air, making it look almost warm. I wrote it 6 times, he said. She turned. The advertisement? First version was too formal. Second one sounded desperate. Somewhere around the 4th one, I gave up trying to make it sound like something it wasn't and just said what I meant. She thought about this folded paper she'd read until the creases went soft. Honest correspondence only. It worked, she said. Apparently. His voice was dry, and she laughed. Actually laughed. The first real one since she'd arrived. The kind that surprised her a little on the way out. He looked pleased, briefly, in the unselfconscious way of a man who doesn't often try to be funny and is caught off guard by succeeding. But Owen Harker was the first of the ranch hands to actually talk to her, beyond the polite minimum. He found her one afternoon in the small room off the main hall that Gideon had said she could use for the accounts. It had been storing harness equipment and some old tools, and Teofilo had helped her move those out without being asked. And he knocked on the open door frame like someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. Miss Mercer? Sorry to bother you. You're not bothering me, she said, which was mostly true. He came in a few steps. He was carrying his hat in both hands, which she was coming to recognize as the frontier version of a man being careful. I just wanted to... Gideon said you were looking at the supply costs, the feed, and the winter hay stores? I am. Why? Well, he glanced at the door. The man we've been buying from, in Mescalero? His prices went up last winter, and Gideon didn't notice or didn't say anything, and I looked at what we paid and I thought... He stopped. I probably should have said something to Gideon directly. Why didn't you? Owen turned the hat over in his hands. I don't know that Gideon always wants... He stopped again, choosing words. He's not bad to work for. He's fair. But sometimes bringing him a problem that looks like a criticism of how he's been doing things, it doesn't always land easy. Adeline thought about that. About what it meant that a 22-year-old ranch hand had noticed a pricing discrepancy and sat on it because he didn't know how to bring it up. Tell me what you found, she said. He did. It was a real discrepancy. Not enormous, but not small. And it had gone unnoticed because Gideon had been buying from the same man for 4 years and had stopped checking the unit price against the delivery weight. You've got a good eye for numbers, she said. Owen looked faintly startled. My mother kept shop, he said. You learn. You do. She made a note. I'll look into it. And Owen, if you see something like this again, you can tell me directly. That's what I'm here for. He nodded, and something in his posture changed. Not dramatically, but she noticed. The thing about Lord's Gate was that it watched. She'd known this from the first day, but she understood it more specifically now that she was moving through the town regularly. For supplies, for the post office, for the occasional social gathering she attended because Gideon said he thought it would be useful, and she'd decided to trust his read of these things. They watched the ranch arrangement with particular interest. The talk, she gathered from fragments and implications, went something like this. Gideon Hale had sent east for a practical wife, which was sensible if unromantic. The woman had arrived half dead, which was inauspicious. She appeared to be recovering, which was acknowledged, and she appeared to be doing something with his account books, which was either forward-thinking or presumptuous, depending on who you asked. Frances Aldrich, it was clear, had her own interpretation. They crossed paths again at the general store, on a Thursday morning when Adeline had gone in for thread and a new accounting pen and some oil for the desk lamp. Frances was there with a woman Adeline didn't know, a younger one who deferred to Frances in the way that indicated a friendship built on unequal footing. Adeline, Frances's voice was warm and correct. How are you settling in? Very well, thank you. I hear you've been reorganizing things at the Hale Ranch. She said reorganizing in the particular way that kept it exactly ambiguous. Could be complimentary. Could be something else. Just the accounts, Adeline said. That's industrious of you. Frances turned slightly, including her companion. Gideon's always been so focused on the land side of things. He never really gave much attention to the paperwork. She looked back at Adeline with a small, calibrated smile. It's good that you've found a purpose. A purpose. As if that were a consolation prize. As if finding one were something to be grateful for. Adeline held the woman's gaze. I find it more interesting than a purpose, she said. I find it essential. The numbers are how you know whether what you're building is actually working. A flicker of something in Frances's eyes. Not anger, she was too composed for that, but a recalibration, similar to the one she'd seen in Gideon that first morning over the ledgers. Of course, Frances said. And then, because she was smart, you must have had excellent training. I did, Adeline said. My father taught me. She paid for her things and left. Outside, the wind was up again. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment, breathing it in, the dust and the sage smell and the dry heat. Her hands were perfectly steady. She'd handled worse than Frances Aldrich. She'd handled a warehouse full of men who thought a woman pointing at a number was probably pointing at the wrong one. She'd handled 2 years of being on her own in a city that had no particular interest in what happened to her. She'd handled 3 weeks of fever on a stagecoach. Frances Aldrich, with her careful pleasantness and her father's waterboard connections, was a problem. But she was a manageable problem, and Adeline had learned that the first step in managing a problem was refusing to be intimidated by it. It was Teofilo who told her about the water. He didn't intend to. It came out sideways during a conversation about the eastern pasture, the one where the grazing rights had been in dispute. She'd asked him about the terrain out there, whether the land was worth fighting for or whether it was marginal, and he'd said it was decent land but that its real value was the seasonal creek that crossed the corner of it. Water rights in this territory, he said, turning his hat brim in his hands. All the men seemed to do this when they were thinking, she'd noticed. They're the real question. More than the land itself, the land's just land. Water is what the land is worth. She'd looked at the survey maps that afternoon and understood it immediately. The eastern parcel's creek fed down from the mesa runoff, and it crossed through land that Leonard Aldrich had been quietly acquiring around the edges. Not the parcel itself, the rights dispute hadn't gone that far, but adjacent to it. She stared at the map for a long time. If Aldrich controlled the surrounding land, a favorable ruling on the grazing rights dispute could give him grounds to challenge the water use. It was a slow play, the kind that took years to set up and happened so gradually that you didn't see the shape of it until you were already in the middle of it. When Gideon came in from the evening check, she was still at the desk. Look at this, she said without preamble. He came and looked. She walked him through it, the parcel, the creek, the adjacent acquisitions she'd found noted in the county records that the lawyer in town had let her look through the previous week. She'd told him she was just familiarizing herself with the territory, which was true as far as it went. Gideon stood behind her and didn't say anything for a while. You think that's deliberate, he said finally. I think it's too careful to be accidental. Another silence. She could hear him processing it, the way some things take time to settle into their real shape when you've been too close to them to see it. I've known Leonard Aldrich 12 years, he said. I'm sure you have. That doesn't mean you're wrong, he exhaled, slow and controlled. It means I should have seen it. She didn't say anything to that. It wasn't a moment that wanted reassurance. "What would you do?" he asked. It came out straightforward, not like he was testing her, like he actually wanted to know. "I'd get the grazing rights settled before the water question becomes explicit," she said. "Right now it's all potential. Once Aldrich moves to make it real, you're on his timeline. Get ahead of it. That means going to the water board, which means going around Aldrich, which means he knows we've figured it out." "Yes," she said, "but you knowing and him knowing you know, that's a different situation than him watching you walk into a trap." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. She turned in the chair to look at him. He was looking at the map, at the creek line she'd traced in pencil, and his face had the particular stillness of someone making a decision they've been putting off. "All right," he said, "I'll ride to the county seat this week." "I could go with you," she said, "if you want a second set of ears on whatever the board says." He looked at her. Not with surprise exactly. She got the sense he was past that particular reaction, at least where she was concerned, but with something more deliberate. "Yeah," he said, "I think that would be useful." It wasn't a grand moment. The lamp was burning low, and the maps were spread across a desk that still smelled faintly of harness oil, and outside the wind was doing something loud against the north wall of the house. But something had settled between them, in that room, that hadn't quite been there before. Not romance. Nothing so simple as that. Something more like recognition. The way two people discover, not all at once but in pieces, that they are actually equal to each other. She turned back to the maps and kept working. And Gideon went to make coffee and came back with 2 cups and set one beside her without comment and pulled up a chair. The ride to the county seat took most of a day each way, and Gideon had initially suggested she wait in Lordsgate while he went ahead. She'd looked at him across the breakfast table and said nothing. Just looked. "Right," he said after a moment, and went to saddle the second horse. The county seat was a town called Alderton, larger than Lordsgate by a factor of 3, with a proper courthouse and a land office, and 2 hotels and a bank that had actual columns on the front, like it was trying to be something in New York. The water board met in a back room of the courthouse on Tuesdays, which meant they'd timed the ride to arrive Monday evening and stay the night. Adeline had packed the relevant documents into a leather satchel. The survey maps, the grazing rights correspondence, the county deed records she'd copied out longhand because the originals couldn't leave the land office, and a 2-page summary she'd written herself laying out the situation in plain language. She'd debated the summary. Some men in official positions didn't like to be presented with a woman's interpretation of a legal matter, but she'd decided that walking in without it was worse than walking in with it, and that if someone objected to the document's existence, she'd deal with that when it happened. Gideon had read the summary the night before they left. He'd sat with it for a long time, going back to certain sections, and then looked up and said, "This is good work. Thank you. I mean it. The part about the precedent from the 79 water ruling. I wouldn't have known to look for that." "The land office clerk was helpful," she said, "once I explained what I was looking for." "How did you explain it?" "I told him I was helping my husband organize the property records." She'd paused. "I used the word loosely." Gideon had been quiet for a second. "Did it work?" "He showed me 3 filing cabinets." That had gotten a real laugh from him, the kind that started in the chest and came out unguarded. She'd filed it away. The fact of it, what it looked like when he laughed without thinking about it. The water board meeting was not what she'd anticipated, which was becoming a pattern in this territory. She'd expected formal. What she got was 4 men in a room with 2 windows that needed cleaning, a table that wobbled on one leg, and the particular atmosphere of men who'd been doing something for years and had stopped questioning whether they were doing it well. The chairman was a man named Dorset, somewhere in his 60s, who had the look of someone who'd decided long ago that life was a series of inconveniences to be processed in order. He'd looked at Adeline when she came in with Gideon, and then he'd looked at the satchel in her hand, and then he'd looked at Gideon. "This your wife?" "This is Adeline Mercer," Gideon said. "She's been managing the ranch accounts and property records." "Uh-huh." Dorset looked at her again. "You got paperwork?" "I do," she said, and put the satchel on the table and opened it. She'd learned something in 4 years of being the only woman in rooms full of men who weren't sure she should be there. You didn't win those rooms by being apologetic, and you didn't win them by being aggressive. You won them by being so thoroughly prepared that the inconvenience of your presence became less interesting than the content of what you'd brought. She walked Dorset and the other 3 board members through the survey maps first, then the deed records, then the precedent ruling. She spoke clearly and without rushing. She answered the questions that were actual questions and redirected the ones that were really just doubt wearing a question's clothing. The meeting lasted an hour and 20 minutes. When they came out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun, Gideon stopped on the steps and was quiet for a moment. "They're going to rule in our favor," he said. It wasn't really a question. "I think so. Dorset understood the water precedent once I showed him the 1879 filing. The other 3 follow his lead." She paused. "It'll take 6 weeks for the formal ruling, and Aldrich will likely hear about the meeting before we're back to Lord's Gate." "Let him." Gideon's voice had something flat and final in it. "I should have dealt with this 2 years ago." They ate dinner at the hotel's small dining room, and it was the first time she'd sat across from him at a table that wasn't their own kitchen, in a room with other people, and she noticed the way the other diners placed them. A couple, obviously, sitting with the ease of people who'd shared many meals. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just a new angle on something she was still trying to see clearly. "Can I ask you something?" she said over the coffee. "You've never asked permission before. Can I ask you something that's personal?" He looked at her steadily. "Go ahead." "The advertisement, the arrangement." She measured her words. Had you thought about marrying before? Someone from here?" He turned the cup in his hands. She'd half expected him to be guarded, but he answered without making her wait. "There was a woman, 6 years back. Before I had much. She was from a family in the valley, decent people, and it was mutual, I think, for a while. But she wanted something more settled than what I had, and she was right to want it. She married a man in Alderton who ran the hardware supply." He paused. "I wasn't angry about it. I understood. But after that, I put the work first for a long time, and after a while, putting the work first becomes the only thing you know. And then you wrote the advertisement." "And then I wrote the advertisement." His mouth turned slightly. "Which I did, as I said, 6 times. She smiled down at her coffee. "I'm glad you sent the version you sent." "Which part of it?" "The honest part," she said. "Where you said what you actually meant instead of what sounded better." He looked at her across the table and said, "I'm glad you answered it." It was such a direct thing to say that it sat in the air between them for a moment before either of them moved. Not romantic, exactly. Nothing with candlelight and rehearsed words. Just a true thing said plainly, which, she was learning, was his way. Leonard Aldrich did not respond quietly. The formal ruling from the water board came, as Dorset had estimated, in the 6th week, and it went in Gideon's favor on all points. The eastern parcel's grazing rights were confirmed, the water use from the seasonal creek was documented and protected, and the adjacent land acquisitions that Aldrich had been making were noted in the record, which meant that any future attempt to challenge the water use would have to explain itself against an established history. Adeline had been the one to read the formal document when it arrived, sitting at the desk in the small office room. She'd read it twice before she went to find Gideon, who was out behind the barn doing something to a fence post that apparently required a great deal of sustained force. She'd stood at a reasonable distance until he paused. "We won," she said. He put the post pounder down. His shirt was damp and his hands were dirty, and he stood there for a second, just processing it. "All of it?" "All of it. Exactly as written." He nodded. Once, slowly, like something heavy had been lifted, and he was checking whether his spine still worked. "Good," he said. And that was it. No celebration, no spectacle. He picked up the post pounder and went back to work, and she went back to the office, and that was how they both were. They'd learned this about each other by now. What followed Aldrich's response was different from what she'd expected, and in some ways worse. He didn't come at them directly. That wasn't his style, as Gideon had said, and the ruling had taken direct challenge off the table anyway. What he did instead was work the territory's social geography. Conversation shifted. The man who supplied fence wire from the depot in Alderton started having delivery delays that nobody could quite explain. A merchant in Lordsgate who'd been buying beef from Gideon for 2 years suddenly found a reason to renegotiate the price downward. Small things. Things that could each be explained individually as coincidence or market fluctuation. But Adeline had been keeping records. She'd started it almost by instinct. The habit of documentation was deep in her by now. Years of training that said, if something is happening, you write it down. Dates, names, amounts. The pattern of the delays and the renegotiations mapped against the calendar from the day the water board ruling was filed. She showed it to Gideon on a Thursday evening, laying the pages out on the kitchen table in the order they'd happened. He stood over it for a long time. He's trying to make us bleed, he said, slowly enough that we can't prove it. We can't prove it legally, she said, but we can prove it to ourselves, and that's enough to respond to it. She'd already thought through the steps. The fence wire. There's a supplier in Santa Fe who's been trying to get into this part of the territory for 2 years. I wrote him last week. Gideon looked up. You already wrote him? I didn't commit to anything. I asked about pricing and terms. She met his eyes. If you don't want me making that kind of contact without asking first, tell me. I'll ask first. He looked at her for a long moment. What did he say? He's coming to Lordsgate in 3 weeks. He wants to talk. Then let's talk to him. Gideon looked back at the papers. The beef contract. Merriwell's been dropping hints about this for a while. I didn't take it seriously enough. His dropping the price opens the door for you to take the beef to the consolidated buyers in Albuquerque, she said. I've been looking at their terms. They pay more, and they're not in Aldrich's social orbit. That's a bigger operation to deal with. Yes, but you're ready for it. She said it without hesitation because she'd run the numbers 3 times and they were consistent. The herd size, the quality records, the water security, you have everything they'd want to see. I can put together a presentation. A presentation. Organized materials. What the ranch produces, the projections, the land and water position. She paused. Or I cannot do that and we can just go in and talk, if you think that's better. He considered it. Do the presentation, he said, but keep it simple. These are cattlemen. They want numbers, not decoration. That's all I do is numbers. I know. He almost smiled. That's why I said yes. The presentation took her 12 days to put together, which meant 12 days of working later than she should have and waking up earlier than was strictly healthy. Cross-referencing the ranch's historical production data against market pricing and building out projections under 3 different scenarios. Conservative, expected, and a growth scenario that assumed the new Santa Fe supplier came through on cost reductions. Owen came to the office door on the 9th day and said, Can I ask, are you sleeping? Some. You were up when I came in this morning. I wake up early. He looked at the papers on the desk. Is there something I can help with? She looked at him. He was earnest. She'd decided she liked earnest. It was an undervalued quality in a territory full of people trying to perform toughness. The production records from the fall drives, she said. The written ones in the barn office. Can you copy the herd counts from the last 4 seasons onto a clean sheet? Gideon's handwriting gets difficult in places. I know, Owen said, with the feeling of someone who'd been deciphering it for 2 years. I'll get it done today. He did. He also, without being asked, added the weight estimates from the seasonal tallies, which she hadn't known existed but which turned out to be useful. She adjusted 2 of her projections accordingly. Teofilo said nothing about any of it, but she noticed in the second week that her coffee was always fresh when she came downstairs in the morning, and that someone had repaired the sticky drawer in the desk without comment. She thanked him on a Thursday, and he just nodded and went back to what he was doing. August Willard, characteristically, had not acknowledged anything, but had started leaving the lamp oil can just outside the office door every morning so she wouldn't run out. The meeting with the consolidated buyers representative, a man named Carlton Briggs, 40-ish, with the specific efficiency of someone who handled a lot of accounts and valued people who didn't waste his time, happened on a Tuesday in the back room of the Lordsgate Hotel. Adeline had put together 4 pages of organized materials. She'd debated whether to present them herself or let Gideon take the lead. They'd talked about it the night before, sitting on the porch after dinner. Your call, Gideon had said. You built it. Your ranch, she'd said. They're going to look at you. They're going to look at both of us, he said. Briggs is practical. He doesn't care about convention. He cares about whether the numbers are real. He paused. Present it together. You take the financial side, I'll take the land and herd questions. Have you worked like that before? With anyone? He shook his head. Not really. A pause. Feels right, though. It had felt right in the room, too, though not seamlessly. Gideon at one point answered a question she'd been about to answer, and she'd pulled back, and there'd been a second of adjustment between them that Briggs had noticed and tactfully ignored. But the materials were solid, the numbers were real, and Gideon knew his land and cattle the way a man knows things he's staked his life on. By the end of the hour, Briggs had stopped leaning back in his chair and was leaning forward. They didn't sign anything that day. Briggs said he'd take the proposal to his principals, which was what these conversations always said at the end. But on his way out, he'd shaken Gideon's hand and then turned to Adeline and said, "Whoever put those projections together did good work. They're honest. The conservative scenario actually being conservative, you'd be surprised how rare that is." "It's the only kind worth making," she said. He'd nodded and left, and she and Gideon had stood in the hotel corridor for a moment. "That went well?" she said. "Yeah," he said. He was looking at her with the particular expression she'd seen before, the one that was measuring something she couldn't quite read. It did. The drought warning came from Teofilo, who'd been watching the sky and the creek levels since before Adeline had arrived, and who had the rancher's hard-won instinct for reading things that hadn't happened yet. "We're going into a dry spell," he told Gideon, on a morning in late summer when the air already felt brittle before noon. "I've seen this before. The mesa grass is going early, and the creek's down 6 inches from last year at this date." Gideon had listened without argument. He'd learned, she gathered, that Teofilo's instincts about weather were worth more than the almanac. They'd talked that evening about what it meant. A dry spell of any serious length would stress the grazing land, force earlier selling of some of the herd than planned, put pressure on the winter feed supplies. It wasn't catastrophe, not yet, but it was the kind of thing that went bad fast if you waited to respond. Adeline had stayed up late that night with the ledgers, running the numbers on an early sell scenario, checking what the Albuquerque market rates would do to the revenue if they moved 60 head before the fall drive rather than after. She'd also looked at the hay stores and done math on acquisition costs from the Santa Fe supplier, who they'd now contracted with, and who had so far been reliable on both delivery and price. She'd been so deep into the numbers that she hadn't heard Gideon come downstairs. She'd looked up and found him standing in the doorway in the dark of the hall, still dressed, holding a lamp. "You're up late," he said. "Drought math," she said. "Come to any conclusions?" "Come look." "What?" He came and sat beside her, not across the desk like in early conversations, but next to her, where they could both see the papers. She walked him through it. The early sell timing, the hay numbers. A third scenario she'd run where they reduced the herd size going into winter and reinvested the capital in land improvement so the spring pasture could carry a larger drive. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both of which were the right questions. He pointed to a number in the hay cost projection and said, "This is off. The Santa Fe price doesn't include the freight west of the junction." She checked. He was right. She corrected it and ran the calculation again. "Still works," she said. "Smaller margin." "Smaller margin's fine." He looked at the papers. "You'd go with the third scenario?" "I'd go with the third scenario," she said. "But it's your ranch." "It's our ranch," he said. He said it simply, without emphasis, without ceremony, like it was already true and he was just acknowledging it. She went still for a second, looking at the papers. "Gideon?" "I know," he said. I'm not making a speech. I'm just saying what it is." She looked at him then. The lamp was between them, throwing light up at both their faces from below, and he was looking at her steadily in the way he had, that direct, unambiguous way of looking that she'd learned to read as meaning exactly what it appeared to mean. "We should talk about that," she said carefully. "About what it actually is, what the arrangement is." "Yes," he said. "We should." "Not now," she said. "When we're not both exhausted and looking at drought projections." A pause. The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair enough," he said. He stood and picked up the lamp and went back upstairs, and she sat for another few minutes in the dark looking at the papers. And then she let herself think about what he'd said. Our ranch. And the way he'd said it, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And she thought, well. The conversation they'd promised each other happened 2 weeks later, though not when either of them had planned it. It happened on a ridge. Gideon had ridden out to check the eastern pasture, the one the water ruling had protected, and she'd gone with him. She did this sometimes now, accompanied him on the longer property checks, partly because she needed to understand the land to understand the numbers, and partly because she liked being out of the office and in the air. She'd become a reasonable rider since arriving. This territory did not permit you to be bad at things you needed to do. The eastern pasture sat at the back of the property, where the land rose toward the mesa. The seasonal creek ran along the lower edge, and from the ridge at the top of the pasture, you could see back across the whole of the Hale Ranch. The house, the barn, the corrals, the kitchen garden, the bunkhouse, and beyond those the first of the grazing land spreading out toward Lord's Gate in the distance. They'd stopped on the ridge because the horses needed a rest, and because neither of them had said so, but both seemed to want to stop. The afternoon light was doing what it did in this territory. That particular slanted gold that made everything look more significant than it probably was. Adeline had stood there looking at it for a while. The distance, the size of it. She'd grown up in a city where your sense of space was bounded by buildings, and even now, months into being here, she could still be surprised by how far you could see. It's a lot of land, she said. Getting bigger, Gideon said. If Briggs comes through. She nodded. Consolidated Buyers had sent a second letter. The principals wanted to meet. It looked like it was going to happen. You built this from nothing, she said. Or close to it. Close to it. Does that ever... She tried to find the right word. Does it ever feel like too much? All of it? He was quiet for a moment. Sometimes, he said. At 3 in the morning, when something goes wrong, or when the market shifts and you can't see 3 months ahead. Yeah. He looked out at the land. But most of the time it feels like the thing I was supposed to be doing, not in a mystical way, just in the sense that it fits. She understood that. The way work that fit felt different from work that didn't. Can I ask you something? He said. You've never asked permission before, she said, which was what he'd said to her in Alderton, and he remembered it. She saw him register it. Philadelphia, he said. If things had been different, if the fire hadn't happened and the warehouse had kept going, do you think you'd have stayed? She thought about it honestly. The room on Chestnut Street, the seamstress's shop, the city she'd grown up in and that had never quite fit around her the way a city was supposed to fit. No, she said. I think I'd have found a reason to leave eventually. The warehouse was good, but it wasn't mine. I was always managing something someone else had built. She paused. Here, It matters differently. He turned to look at her. I'm not saying that to tell you what you want to hear, she said. I mean it plainly. I know you do, he said. You're not built for telling people what they want to hear. No, she agreed. I'm not. He was quiet for a moment. The horses shifted behind them. Somewhere down the slope, a coyote called and got an answer from somewhere farther off. Adeline, he said. Yes. When I wrote that advertisement, when I said I wanted a capable woman who understood that this life was difficult. He stopped. Started again, which was unusual for him. He was not normally a man who started sentences over. I was thinking practically. I needed someone who could hold their ground out here. That was the real requirement. I know. What I didn't... He paused again. I didn't anticipate that I'd... He exhaled, and there was something almost frustrated in it. The expression of a man who handles most things well and is irritated to find himself handling this one badly. I'm not good at this part, he said. The talking part? The talking about what I actually feel part. She turned to face him fully, because that deserved to be met directly. Then don't talk around it, she said. You never do with anything else. He looked at her, that steady, direct, unflinching look. I didn't expect to fall in love with you, he said. That wasn't in the plan, but I think I have been for a while, and I don't know what to do with that because what we have works, and I don't want to make it complicated. And Gideon, he stopped. You talking to me about this, she said, is the least complicated thing you could do. He blinked. Like that hadn't been the response he'd prepared for. Because the alternative, she said, is both of us pretending we don't know what's been happening here for the last 3 months. And I've never been good at pretending. She looked at him steadily. I'm not in the habit of using the word either, but I think you should know that it's not one-sided. The light was doing its evening thing, coming in low and amber, and below them the land spread out in every direction. And Gideon Hale, who had carried her off a stagecoach when she was barely standing, who had sat in the dark with her through a fever, who had set our ranch in the lamplight like it was simply true, looked at her with his whole face open in a way she hadn't quite seen before. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it, like you'd pick up something that had been set down near you and that you'd realized belonged to you. She let him. She laced her fingers through his and looked back out at the land. They stood there for a while on the ridge, with the wind moving through the mesa grass below them and the light going long and slow across everything they'd spent months building together. And neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything left to say that the moment wasn't already saying. Eventually, one of the horses blew and shifted its weight, and the spell relaxed into something more ordinary. 2 people who needed to ride back before dark. We should go, she said. Yeah, he said. But he didn't let go of her hand for another moment. When they finally turned back to the horses, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not the small, careful satisfaction of numbers that balanced, or the particular relief of a problem solved. Something bigger than that. Something that didn't have a word in the accounting books. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up, and Gideon mounted beside her, and they started back down the ridge toward the light in the farmhouse windows below, toward the smell of wood smoke and the sound of the ranch settling into its evening and the whole complicated, unfinished, ongoing fact of the life they were making. They married on a Saturday in October, 6 months after Adeline had collapsed getting off a stagecoach in front of half the town. The ceremony was at the Lord's Gate Courthouse, not a church, which suited them both. Gideon because he was a practical man who didn't see the need for spectacle, and Adeline because she'd decided that if she was going to make a vow she intended to keep, she'd rather make it in a room where the weight of it was between her and Gideon and nobody else. Judge Terrence Fowler, who was 71 and had been officiating civil ceremonies in this territory since before Lord's Gate had a proper name, conducted it in 11 minutes. Teofilo and Owen stood as witnesses. August Willard had come too, which nobody had expected, and stood near the back wall with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man attending a thing he considered significant without having words for why. Mrs. Emery, who had nursed Adeline through the fever and never made a fuss about it since, had brought a small cake from her kitchen. She set it on the courthouse steps afterward and cut it with the same brisk efficiency she applied to everything. Well, she said, handing Adeline the first piece, you lasted longer than the town gave you. How long did the town give me? Oh, 2 weeks was the generous estimate. Old Haskell at the Mercantile had you on a stage back east inside a month. Adeline looked at the cake on the plate. It was a good cake. Spice, with something that might have been dried apple. What did you give me? Mrs. Emery considered this. I gave you better odds than Haskell. You had a look about you. She moved on to the next piece without elaborating, which was its own kind of compliment. Gideon, beside her, leaned down slightly and said quietly, What look? I have no idea, she said, but I'll take it. The celebration, such as it was, lasted 2 hours on the courthouse steps in the thin October sun, and then they drove home because there was still work to do, and they were both people who understood that the work didn't stop because you'd had a good day. What followed was not a honeymoon in any conventional sense. The dry spell Teofilo had predicted had come in exactly as feared, not catastrophic, not the kind of drought that broke whole territories, but persistent and grinding in the way of a problem that doesn't kill you but doesn't let you rest either. The creek was down. The eastern pasture grass had gone brown 2 months earlier than usual. The winter hay situation required constant management. They worked through it together, and that was the thing Adeline would think about later when she tried to identify the moment the marriage became real in the way that mattered beyond the courthouse and the cake. It wasn't a single moment. It was this. The two of them at the kitchen table at 10 at night going over feed costs and herd projections, or writing the property line in weather that had no interest in being pleasant, or disagreeing about whether to bring in extra hands for the winter, and neither of them backing down until they'd worked through the numbers together and arrived at a third answer neither had started with. They disagreed regularly. This had surprised her. In the beginning, she'd had some half-formed idea that once you'd told someone you loved them, the friction would ease. It didn't. Gideon had opinions, and he held them, and she had opinions, and she held hers, and there were conversations that got loud before they got resolved. The worst one happened in November, 6 weeks into the marriage, over the consolidated buyer's contract. Briggs had come back with a formal offer. It was good, better than the local buyers, better than the Albuquerque rates she'd been projecting against, but it had a clause that locked the ranch into minimum herd delivery commitments for 3 years. Gideon wanted to sign it immediately. Adeline wanted to negotiate the commitment clause down. 3 years is too long to be locked at a minimum in a drought period, she said. If the dry spell goes another season, we could be in breach. We won't be in breach, Gideon said. The herd can carry those numbers. On a good year, on a year like this one, we'd have been short by 30 head in the fall drive. This year was worse than usual. And next year could be worse again. That's what drought does, Gideon. It doesn't announce itself in advance. They were standing in the kitchen, which had become their argument room by default. Too small to pace properly, just big enough for 2 people to stand opposite each other and not have anywhere to go. Gideon had his arms folded, which she'd learned meant he wasn't going to move easily. She had her hands flat on the table, which he'd apparently learned meant the same thing about her. If we don't commit, he said, Briggs takes the contract to someone else. If we commit and we can't deliver, we pay penalties that could run us into the ground. She pushed the contract across the table to the page she'd marked. Read the penalty clause. Read it carefully. He read it. She waited. That's steep, he said. Yes, she said. It is. A long pause. What would you change it to? 2 years instead of 3, and a drought and disaster exception clause. I've already drafted language for it. He looked at her. You drafted language for it. Last night, after you went to sleep. Another pause. The kind where she could see him working through being annoyed at the method while acknowledging the result. Show me, he said. She showed him. He read it 3 times, asked one question about the exception trigger language, and then said, All right, we take this to Briggs. He may say no. Then we negotiate. That's what you do. He almost smiled. You taught me that. She hadn't taught him that. He'd known it, but she took the point in the spirit it was offered. Briggs did not say no. He pushed back on the exception language, they modified it twice over 2 letters, and the final contract had a 2-year commitment period with a partial force majeure exception that wouldn't cover everything but covered enough. It wasn't perfect. It was workable, and in this territory workable was usually the realistic ceiling. The morning she filed the signed contract in the desk drawer and closed it, she stood at the office window for a moment looking out at the corrals, and she felt the particular satisfaction of something that had been difficult arriving at its resolution. Then she went and found Gideon and told him it was done, and he said good, and she said good, and they went back to work. Owen Harker gave his notice in December. He came to find Gideon on a Tuesday morning, hat in both hands as always, and said that he'd been offered a position managing a smaller ranch up in the Northern Territory, a new operation belonging to a family that had moved out from Colorado. It was a step up, real managing responsibility, his name on the paperwork. He was 23, and it was the right move, and everyone, including Gideon, knew it. You'll be good at it, Gideon said. Owen looked relieved not to have to argue for himself. I learned more here than I expected to, he said. He paused, and then looked at Adeline, who was standing near the porch rail, especially about the numbers side of things. Keep writing things down, she said. Even when it seems like you'll remember, you won't. He nodded seriously, the way he did when he was filing something away. Yes, ma'am. She'd told him twice to stop calling her ma'am. It hadn't taken. She'd stopped trying. They hired 2 new hands in the spring, a man named Dario, who was Teofilo's recommendation, and arrived already knowing how the operation worked from Teofilo's description of it, and a woman named Ruth, 40-odd, who'd been running cattle on her own land 2 counties over until a bad season had taken the operation down and left her looking for work. Ruth had shown up asking to speak to whoever did the hiring, been directed to Adeline, and conducted herself through the conversation with the compressed dignity of someone who was not accustomed to asking for things and was doing it anyway. Adeline had hired her before Gideon knew there was a candidate. He'd come home from a supply run to find Ruth already familiarizing herself with the barn layout, and had stopped in the yard and looked at Adeline with an expression that was more amused than anything else. "You hired someone. You said we needed another hand for spring. I meant we should look for one." I looked. She was right there. Adeline paused. She ran her own operation for 8 years. She knows cattle better than Owen did when he arrived. Gideon had looked back toward the barn, where Ruth was already in conversation with Teofilo about something that involved gesturing at the hay storage. "All right," he said. "You haven't even talked to her yet." "I trust your read," he said, and Teofilo's clearly already given his opinion. She had been right about Ruth, who turned out to be one of the best decisions the ranch made that year. And Gideon had been right to trust her read, which she noted and didn't rub in because that wasn't how she preferred to win. The Aldrich situation resolved itself, in the end, in a way nobody had engineered. Leonard Aldrich's Eastern buyers consolidated into a larger house in '86, and the new arrangement cut the premium pricing that had made the Aldrich operation so dominant. It didn't break him. He was too established for one restructuring to do that, but it leveled the field in ways that his accumulated pressure tactics had been designed to prevent. 2 of the merchants he'd been influencing quietly shifted their buying back to Gideon's range, either because the reason not to had disappeared or because the reason to had always been there and was now simply more convenient to act on. Francis Aldrich married a man from Tucson in the spring. Adeline heard about it from Mrs. Emery in the way she heard most things, as a side note in a conversation about something else dropped in without drama. She registered it and moved on. That was the other thing she'd learned about this territory. Most of what felt like conflict eventually passed. Not because people became better or the problems solved themselves, but because the land just kept going. The seasons turned, the market shifted, people made decisions that changed the geometry, and things that had seemed fixed revealed themselves as temporary. You had to hold on through the temporary parts and be ready when they changed. She was, by now, known in Lordsgate. That had happened gradually, through the courthouse and the water board and the consolidated buyer's contract and the general accumulation of being somewhere long enough that people stopped wondering about you and started just knowing you. Mrs. Bellingham had revised her original assessment, not with an apology, she wasn't that kind of woman, but with a gradual shift in the temperature of her greetings, which eventually arrived at something that might charitably be called warmth. Haskell at the Mercantile, who had apparently given her 2 weeks and lost, was now one of her better sources of territory gossip, which he dispensed while charging her fairly and pretending the reversal of his earlier opinion hadn't happened. She had made, over the year, something that surprised her more than most things: a friend. Her name was Clara Denning, no relation to her aunt, and she ran the schoolhouse at the edge of town, a one-room operation with 14 students ranging from 6 to 15. Clara was 30, sharp, and had the specific humor of someone who'd been underestimated so often she'd learned to use it. They'd met properly at a town meeting about road improvements, where both of them had ended up at the edge of the same argument with the same opinion, and nobody had been particularly interested in hearing it, and had walked home afterward in the same direction and found they had more to say to each other than either had been given the chance to say in the meeting. Clara came out to the ranch on Sunday afternoons sometimes. She and Adeline would sit on the porch or at the kitchen table and talk about things that weren't the ranch: books, Clara's students, the territory's political situation, the question of whether women would see the vote in their lifetimes, which Clara thought was later than it should be, and Adeline thought was probably right, but kept that opinion private in rooms where it would cost more than it was worth. Gideon liked Clara. He expressed this in his characteristic way by being unremarkable around her while not performing friendliness, just being normally himself, which Adeline had learned to read as his actual form of approval. "She's good for you," he said once, after Clara had left. "How do you mean?" "You need someone who talks back," he said. "I do it, but I'm always connected to the ranch, to the business. You need someone who's outside all of that." She'd looked at him across the table. It was such a perceptive thing to say, and he'd said it so matter-of-factly, like it was obvious, like of course you thought about what the people you loved needed even when it wasn't about you. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged. "It's true." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm thanking you." "Os, The pregnancy announced itself in January of their second year, and Adeline sat with the knowledge for 2 days before she told Gideon, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to be sure she'd gotten her own thinking straight before she handed it to someone else to react to. She told him on a Thursday morning, straight out, across the breakfast table. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I'm healthy. I've been through worse than this." "I know you have," he said. How are you feeling about it?" "Honestly? Scared." She held his gaze. "And also, it's what I want. I didn't entirely know that until just now, saying it out loud." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. No speech, no performance of the moment. "Okay," he said, "we'll figure it out. There are going to be months when I can't." "We'll figure it out," he said again, the same tone, the same steadiness. "Stop getting ahead of yourself." She laughed a little shakily. "That's my primary skill set." "I know. Give yourself a day off from it." She couldn't give herself a day off from it, as he well knew, but she understood what he meant and tried to honor the spirit of it. The pregnancy was hard in the second trimester in ways she hadn't anticipated, and easier in the third than she'd been warned. She kept working through most of it, modified, slower, with Ruth picking up the physical parts of the property management she could no longer do sensibly. Clara came more often. Mrs. Emery reappeared with the same brisk competence she'd applied to the fever, as if biological events were simply another category of frontier inconvenience to be processed efficiently. She didn't have quite the right word for it. He was not hovering, because hovering wasn't in him. But he was present in a way that was so consistent she only fully noticed it when it occurred to her that she'd never once, in those months, had to wonder where he was or whether she could reach him. He simply made himself reachable, day after day, without making a production of it. Their daughter was born in September, delivered by the Lord's Gate doctor with Mrs. Emery assisting in the bedroom at the top of the stairs where Adeline had broken her fever 14 months before. The labor was long and not the kind of thing she would describe to anyone afterward, using words like fine or easy. And at the worst of it, she'd gripped the bedpost and made her mind very blank, and just moved through it the way she'd moved through the stagecoach fever. 1 hour, then the next, then the next. When it was done and the doctor had placed the child in her arms, she was so tired she thought she might not be able to feel anything for a while. But she was wrong about that. The feeling came immediately, like a door opening that you hadn't expected to be there. Gideon had been in the hallway. They'd kept him out of the room, which was the convention, and he'd apparently spent 3 hours sitting on the top stair not moving, which she only found out later from Mrs. Emery, who'd reported it with the tone of a woman who found this information significant. When they let him in, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the child in her arms, and then looked at Adeline, and his face was doing something she'd never seen it do before. Completely open, no composure, just the raw fact of the feeling underneath. He reached out and put one large, weathered hand very gently against his daughter's head. She said, "She looks like you." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if his voice had been steadier. "She's got your expression," he said, "already. She's looking at everything like she's taking inventory." Adeline looked at the small face, the wide, unfocused eyes moving slowly around the room. "She'll have to learn to walk first," she said. "Give her time," Gideon said. "She'll figure it out." They named her Margaret, after nobody, just because it was a solid name that seemed to fit the territory and the weight of what they were building. And from the first week she was a fact of the ranch the way the house and the cattle and the work were facts of it, something that had always been going to be there and had simply now arrived. The ranch kept growing. The consolidated buyer's contract renewed at better terms, because the first 2 years had been clean, and Briggs had told his principals that the Hale operation was the kind of account you kept. The Santa Fe supplier had worked out so well that Gideon had quietly become one of his better clients and gotten the pricing that went with that. The eastern pasture, water secured and well managed, was carrying more cattle per season than it had in the ranch's history. Dario had turned out to be as good as Teofilo had said, and Teofilo had taken on an informal foreman's role that nobody had explicitly created but everyone had come to rely on. Adeline had expanded the record-keeping system until it was a proper operation, not just ledgers, but a filing system organized by property, by supplier, by buyer, by season, so that anyone who needed to find something could find it, and so that the picture of the ranch's health could be read at any point without holding it all in your head. She'd trained Ruth on parts of it, and Ruth had proven to be the kind of practical intelligence that could take a system and run with it once she understood why it was built the way it was. There were still hard months. The second winter was brutal in a way that tested the hay stores and cost them 8 head and 2 weeks of Gideon's sleep. A contract dispute with a fence supplier ate 3 months of letters and ended with a settlement that was technically satisfactory and emotionally unsatisfying. Margaret went through 6 weeks in her first year where she apparently didn't believe in sleeping, which aged both her parents in ways that couldn't be attributed to the frontier. And through all of it, the difficult contracts and the difficult winters, and the nights when the baby was crying and the ledgers didn't balance, and the territory was doing what it always did, which was test every decision you'd ever made. They did what they'd been doing since the day she'd pointed at a number in a rough tally and he'd put her in charge of the books. They worked it together. Not harmoniously, not without friction, not in the way of people who'd stopped being two different people with two different sets of instincts, but together, with the particular kind of trust that comes not from being alike, but from having been tested, from knowing what the other person does when things get hard, and knowing that it's enough. The town that had given Adeline 2 weeks had been watching all of this with the slow revision of its opinion that communities allow themselves when they've been wrong but don't want to make too much of it. The respect that came back was different from the tolerance that had preceded it, quieter, more durable, the kind that doesn't announce itself but shows up in the way a meeting room makes space for you or the way a conversation includes you without a beat of hesitation. She was aware of it without being interested in it. The opinion of Lord's Gate was useful information about the territory she lived in. It was not what she was working for. What she was working for was still the same thing she'd come for, and still the same thing she woke up every morning to do. Build something that was worth building, in a place where the building actually mattered. She was doing that. They were doing it. And the doing of it, imperfect and exhausting and real, was enough. Margaret was 7 years old the first time she sat at the desk in the ranch office and asked her mother to teach her how the ledgers worked. It was a Saturday morning, early, the kind of morning where the light came in flat and clear through the east window and the whole territory felt like it was holding its breath before the heat arrived. Adeline had been working through the quarterly accounts, and Margaret had come in, not running, not demanding, just appeared in the doorway the way she'd always appeared in doorways, quiet and watchful, already taking stock before she spoke. "What are those numbers for?" she asked. "They tell us how the ranch is doing," Adeline said, "whether we're making more than we're spending." "Are we?" "This quarter, yes." Margaret came and stood beside the desk and looked at the open ledger. She was a serious child. Not solemn, not unhappy, but serious in the way some children are when they've grown up in a place where the work is real and they've been allowed to see it. She had Gideon's gray-green eyes and his particular quality of stillness, and she had Adeline's way of looking at something new, like it was a problem to be understood rather than a spectacle to be admired. "Can I learn?" she said. Adeline looked at her daughter for a moment. 7 years old, stood in the doorway of an office that had once been a harness room and had been turned into something else entirely. "Pull up a chair," she said. That had been 11 years ago. Time in this territory moved differently than it did in the city, not slower, exactly, but denser. Each year carried more than a calendar year seemed able to hold. The seasons, the drives, the contracts, the disputes, the droughts, and the good rains and the slow accretion of a life being built in a place that had never promised to be easy. By the time Margaret was 18, she could read a set of accounts faster than anyone in the territory except her mother, and she could ride and manage cattle as well as anyone on the ranch except Teofiello, who at 62 was still the most capable person on any piece of land he stood on. By the time she was 20, she was sitting in on the buyer negotiations with Gideon, not as a spectator but as a participant, and the buyers who'd been doing business with the Hale Ranch long enough to have opinions about it accepted this with the pragmatic ease of men who recognize competence when it sat across the table from them and told them where they were wrong. 2 more children had followed Margaret. Thomas came 3 years after her. Easier than Margaret in some ways, harder in others, with Gideon's stubbornness in full and Adeline's impatience stacked on top of it, a combination that produced spectacular arguments throughout his adolescence and, eventually, a young man who was genuinely gifted with horses and who had the instinct for land that his father had always had. The youngest, Clara, named for the schoolteacher who had remained the closest friend Adeline had made in the territory, arrived in the 7th year of the marriage and had from birth the quality of someone who would not be managed, which Adeline had recognized immediately and had decided was probably fine. Teofilo was the one who told Gideon in the spring of the 11th year that his back had gone beyond what the work required. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, sitting in the barn in the afternoon with a coffee cup he wasn't really drinking from. "You need a younger back in this position," he said. "Mine is done." "You're not done," Gideon said. "My back is done," Teofilo said with some precision. "I didn't say I was, but I can't do the work I've been doing, and you need someone who can." He stayed on, at Gideon's insistence and Teofilo's own willingness, in a role that was part consultative and part what it had always been. The person on the property who understood it most completely, who could read the land and the cattle and the weather and the men who worked them. He trained Dario into the foreman position properly, and Dario, who was 40 now and had been with the ranch for 9 years, stepped into it with the steadiness of someone who'd been being prepared for it without the title. Ruth had stayed too. She was past 50, with the specific toughness of a woman who'd been broken and rebuilt by this land and had come out on the other side of it, not bitter, but simply hard in the way of good iron. Not brittle, not soft, just exactly as solid as it needed to be. She and Adeline had developed over the years a working relationship that had at some point, without either of them marking the moment, become something more than that. They didn't talk about this in those terms, both of them being people who found that kind of talk unnecessary, but it was there. The 15th year brought the hardest thing. Gideon had been slowing down in ways she'd noticed and said nothing about, because she'd learned over 15 years that there were observations that wanted time before they became conversations. He was 54, which wasn't old, but the territory had a way of collecting its dues on a body. The decades of hard weather and harder work, and the accumulated injuries that frontier ranching quietly generated. It started with his hands. The stiffness he'd always had in cold mornings became stiffness at all hours, and then pain that he mentioned once and then stopped mentioning because that was his way. She noticed it in how he held his coffee cup, in the slight adjustment he made getting into the saddle, in the way he sometimes stopped midway through a task and just stood for a second, recalibrating. She brought it to him directly on a February evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "Your hands," she said. "They're fine." "Gideon." He looked at her. 15 years of mornings across this table had given her a complete map of his expressions, and the one he was wearing was the one that meant he knew she was right and was deciding whether to concede it. "It comes and goes," he said. "It used to come and go. Now it stays." A pause. "I'm not slowing down," he said. "I'm not asking you to slow down," she said. "I'm asking you to see the doctor in Alderton who treats this. There's new work being done on joint disease. Claire wrote me about a physician in Santa Fe who's been getting results." He was quiet. "I can't tell you what to do," she said. "You know that. You've never done anything because I told you to. But I'm asking you to go." He looked at his hands on the table, the knuckles that had thickened over the past 2 years, the way the right hand didn't quite close fully anymore. "I'll go," he said. "Next week." "This week," she said. Another pause. "This week," he said. The doctor in Alderton confirmed what she'd already understood from her reading, and gave it a name, and gave him a set of treatments that were partly useful and partly not. The physician in Santa Fe, she went with him, they made the trip in April when the pass was clear, was more specific and more helpful, and adjusted the treatment in ways that made a real difference over the following months. Not a cure, not a restoration to how he'd been, but a management, a way of continuing. On the ride back from Santa Fe, through the mesa country in the particular spring light that made the rock faces look like they were lit from inside, Gideon had been quiet for a long stretch, and then said, "I've been thinking about Thomas and the North Parcel." She waited. "If we put him on it properly, not just running cattle, but managing it as its own operation, he'd be ready. He knows the land. He's better with horses than I was at his age. He needs to learn the accounts," she said. "He avoids them. He avoids them because he thinks he doesn't need them." "Which is exactly what you thought at his age, from what you've told me." Gideon glanced sideways at her. "I didn't say that." You did. 2 years into the ranch, you told me your father could never get you to write anything down and it cost him. A pause. I said that? Kitchen table, third winter during the fence supplier dispute. You were in a bad mood and you said things that were true. He was quiet. Then, almost against his will, a small sound that was the beginning of a laugh. You remember everything. I write things down, she said. That's rather the point. He did laugh then, properly, and she felt the loosening of it in her own chest the way she always did when he laughed, even now, even after 15 years. That small, specific relief of it, the way it meant he was still himself. Talk to Thomas, she said, about the accounts. Don't tell him it's what you need him to do. Tell him it's what the North Parcel needs him to do. He'll respond to that. You know him, Gideon said. I know where he came from, she said. Thomas took the North Parcel at 21, with conditions, one of which was learning the accounting system from his mother, which he'd agreed to with the specific martyred grace of a young man who knew he had no real leverage. He turned out, once he engaged with it properly, to be not terrible at numbers. He had a different approach than Adeline, more intuitive, less systematic, but he had Gideon's instinct for what mattered, and once he understood that the numbers were just the land story written in a different language, he stopped fighting it. Margaret ran the main ranch's operations side by side with Gideon through his slower years, and with such unself-conscious capability that the transition between his leading and her leading was invisible from the outside. She had never needed to declare herself. She simply did the work, and the work declared her. Clara, the youngest, their Clara, left for school in Santa Fe at 16. She'd been the one who had always looked at the horizon, even as a small child, in the way that meant she was thinking about what was beyond it. She'd come back eventually, but first she needed to go, and Adeline had understood this completely and had helped her pack. You're not sad? Gideon had asked the evening after Clara left. Of course I'm sad, she said. That's not the same as being wrong. He'd nodded. He understood the difference. In the 18th year of their marriage, the consolidated buyers offered to purchase a minority stake in the Hale Ranch operation. It was the kind of offer that meant something, that you'd been watched and assessed and found to be a going concern in a way that warranted investment. It was also the kind of offer that required very careful reading, because investments came with terms, and terms came with expectations, and expectations, if you weren't precise about them, could become obligations you hadn't agreed to. Adeline spent 2 weeks reading the offer document. She made 3 pages of notes. She wrote 6 questions that required answers before she would recommend anything. Gideon sat across the kitchen table from her. The same table, the same 2 chairs, the same window behind him that had been there since the beginning, and looked at the notes and said, "What's your read? It's a good offer," she said. "If you want the capital for the southern expansion, this is a clean way to fund it. The terms are fair." She paused. "But I want language in the agreement that specifies the Hale family's operational authority is not subject to buyer input below 51% ownership. They're getting a stake, not a voice." "Will they go for that?" "They'll push back. We hold. And if they won't accept it." She looked at him steadily. "Then we fund the southern expansion ourselves, slower, and we own all of it." He looked at the papers. 18 years had put lines in his face that hadn't been there, and gray in his hair that she'd grown so accustomed to, she had to look at early photographs to remember what the dark version had looked like. She supposed she'd changed too. She knew she had. But from inside it was harder to see. "Okay," he said. "Hold on the authority clause." They held. There were 3 letters back and forth that were politely but clearly adversarial, and then Briggs, still Briggs, 20 years older and now a principal himself rather than a representative, called a meeting in Albuquerque and said, with the efficiency of a man who valued time, "Put in the language. We want the partnership. The authority clause is acceptable." She and Gideon had walked out of that meeting into the Albuquerque afternoon, and she'd thought about the first time they'd walked out of a meeting together. The water board in Alderton, the courthouse steps, the drive back through the Mesa country with his rough tally sheet in her hands, and something just beginning between them. "You know," she said, "the first time we went to a meeting together, you handed me the reins." He looked at her sideways. "I remember." "Why did you do that?" He thought about it. "I think I wanted to see what you'd do with them, he said. And? You didn't drop them, he said. That was enough. She smiled at the street ahead of them. That's a low bar. It wasn't, he said. You'd be surprised how many people drop them. Set. Teofilo died in the 20th year, in the autumn, which was the season he'd always said suited him best. He'd been slowing for 2 years with the particular gradual quality of a person whose body was winding down by its own decision, and he'd faced it the way he'd faced everything, with the practical acceptance of a man who had worked hard and wasn't afraid of the accounting. He died in his room in the bunkhouse, which was where he'd wanted to be, and Dario was with him, and that was right. Gideon took it harder than he showed, which was true of everything he took hard. She found him in the barn on the evening after, doing nothing in particular, just standing near the stall of the old sorrel horse that had been Teofilo's preference for the last 4 years. He didn't say anything when she came in. She stood beside him. After a while she said, "He was the first person here who respected you before you'd earned it. He came because of what you might become, not what you were." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I knew that," he said. "I didn't tell him that." "He knew," she said. "A man like that always knows." They stood there in the barn with the dust motes moving in the last of the afternoon light and the horse breathing quietly in the stall. "I want to be buried on the East Ridge," Gideon said after a while. She turned to look at him. He wasn't being morbid, he was being practical, which was the same impulse wearing different clothing, and she recognized it. "That's where you took me," she said. "When you told me." "It's the right place," he said. "It sees all of it." She took his arm, the way she did sometimes, not from sentiment, but from the plain fact of proximity and preference, and all the years that had made those things the same thing. "I want to be there too," she said. "If you don't mind the company." He put his hand over hers. "You've been company since a stagecoach in Lord's Gate," he said. "I don't expect I'd know what to do without it." Chab. The ranch, by the time Margaret was 30, and running it in truth, and not just in practice, was 3 times the size it had been when Adeline arrived. The north parcel under Thomas had become its own operation, still connected, still family, but with its own ledgers and its own hands and its own market relationships that Thomas managed with the slightly chaotic competence of a man who'd learned just enough of his mother's systems to adapt them, and just enough of his father's instinct to trust what he saw. Clara came back from Santa Fe with a teaching credential and a husband named Victor, who was a surveyor and who looked at the territory's land records with the specific excitement of a man who'd found his purpose. She taught at the Lord's Gate schoolhouse that Clara Denning had run. Old Clara Denning had retired 2 years prior, to a small house at the edge of town where she kept a garden and a correspondence with Adeline that had never stopped. And she brought to it the same quality her mother had always brought to the ledgers, the certainty that understanding a thing was worth doing even when nobody was watching. The schoolhouse expanded. Adeline had funded it quietly, without making it a monument, just made sure the building was sound, and the books were there, and the teacher had what she needed. Clara had never asked where the money came from. She knew. Mrs. Emery had passed in the 14th year, still brisk to the end, still cutting cake with authority. Adeline had sat at the funeral and thought about a woman handing her the first piece across courthouse steps and saying you lasted longer than the town gave you, and had felt the specific weight of a world that was full of women like Mrs. Emery, women whose names weren't written into the territory's formal history, but who had held the actual substance of it in place. She'd written it down. She had a habit of writing things down that didn't fit anywhere in the ledgers. Not a diary exactly, more like a record. Things she wanted to remember. People she wanted not to be forgotten. Bob. The 22nd year, Gideon's hands gave him more trouble than they had before, and the doctor in Santa Fe adjusted the treatment again. And for a season, he was limited in ways that required redistribution of the physical work. He handled it with the same quiet stubbornness he'd handled everything. And one morning, she found him attempting to repair a section of fence on the south pasture that he should have delegated, in weather he should not have been working in. She had stood at the fence line and looked at him and said nothing for a long moment. He'd looked back at her. "Don't." "I haven't said anything." "You're saying it very loudly." "I'm not. I'm watching." He lowered the tool he'd been using and looked at the fence post. "I don't like not being able to do what I built this place to do." "I know," she said. It's not the pain," he said. "It's that I used to know this land through my hands, working it. Now I—" He stopped. She walked to where he was standing and took the tool from him and set it against the post and stood beside him. "You know it through Margaret now," she said. "Through Thomas. Through everything you made that's still making." She paused. "A man who builds something that outlasts his hands has built something real. That's all you've been doing for 30 years. He looked out at the pasture. The grass was good this year. The water secured, the land managed, everything that had once been at risk now stable. "You say things," he said, "at exactly the right time. I've had 22 years of practice knowing when you need to hear something. What do I need to hear now?" "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee, and you can tell me what else is wrong, and then we'll figure out what to do about it. Same as always." He looked at her. The gray in his hair, the lines in his face, the hands that had carried her off a stagecoach and built this thing across 30 years. He was 56, and he looked it, and she was 48, and she looked it, and neither of them pretended otherwise because they'd never been good at pretending. "Same as always," he said. They walked back to the house together across the pasture in the morning air, and the land spread out around them in every direction, and it was not perfect. There were still accounts that needed attention, and hands that needed management, and weather that couldn't be controlled, and the 1,000 daily imperfections of a life being lived. But it was theirs, completely and without qualification, in the way that only things you've actually built can be yours. On a morning in October, 23 years after a sick woman had collapsed getting off a stagecoach in Lordsgate, Adeline Hale stood on the east ridge with her husband beside her and her daughter below them in the house where the lights were on early because Margaret ran the operation the way her mother had run it, which was to say relentlessly. Thomas was coming down for the fall muster. He'd sent word 3 days ago. Clara was already there, had arrived the previous week with Victor and their 2 children, who were 7 and 4, and had inherited their grandmother's habit of standing in doorways taking stock of rooms before they entered. The valley below them was full of the work of the season. Cattle in the lower pasture being sorted, the wagon Dario was driving back from the supply depot, the particular organized motion of a place that knew what it was doing and had enough people in it who understood why. Gideon was standing slightly to her left, the way he always stood, and his hands were in his jacket pockets against the morning cold, and he was looking at all of it with the expression she'd known for 20 years, that steady, undramatic, complete attention. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me the morning after I came downstairs the first time, after the fever?" He thought about it. "I said your letters were good." She laughed. "You did! You stood in the doorway and you said my letters were to the point, and you appreciated it, and then you went back to work." It was true. It was the strangest possible thing to say in that moment. "But it worked," he said. "It worked," she agreed. The light was coming in the way it came in October on this ridge, long and amber, the kind that made the land look like it was made of something precious. She'd seen this light 100 times from this spot, and she still couldn't entirely get used to it, which she thought was probably the right response. You shouldn't get used to the things that are actually beautiful. You should keep being a little surprised by them. She thought about the woman who had written an answer to an honest advertisement, because every other option had run out, and had gotten on a stagecoach to cross half a continent to marry a stranger, and had arrived nearly dead and terrified and determined in equal measure. That woman had not known what she was building. She'd just known she needed to build something. This was the thing nobody told you about survival. It wasn't the moment you stayed alive. It was every ordinary morning after that, where you chose again, where you showed up to the work and the people and the life you'd been given and decided to build rather than simply endure. Every account balanced, every negotiation held, every argument that ended with a third answer neither side had started with. It was all of that, compounding over years into something that looked, from a ridge, like legacy. There was no perfect version of this story. The accounts had not always balanced. The rain had not always come. There had been seasons when she'd been so tired she'd sat at the desk and not been sure she had anything left, and had done the work anyway because there was no other option. There had been arguments that went to sleep unresolved, and mornings that started wrong, and years that took more than they gave. The children that she and Gideon had raised were not perfect either. They were people, with all the specific inconvenient reality that implied. They would make their own decisions, some of which would be wrong, some of which would be right in ways that couldn't be predicted from here. The ranch would face seasons she couldn't see from this ridge. The territory would change in ways she'd have to adapt to, and there would be things she adapted to wrong before she adapted to them right. All of that was true. All of it was still ahead. But here, on a ridge on an October morning, with her husband beside her and her daughter in the house below, and the land spread out for miles in every direction, land that had been fought for and watered and worked and protected, year by hard year, in partnership with another person who had chosen the same things she'd chosen. She allowed herself the things she rarely allowed, a complete and unqualified sense of having done what she came to do. She had come to build something. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah." "It's enough," she said. "All of it. It's enough." He turned to look at her. He understood what she meant. He usually did, which was one of the things about him she'd never stopped being grateful for. "It is," he said. Below them, in the valley, the work went on. The season turned. The land held. And on the ridge, two people who had once been strangers, who had built a life not on the promise of ease, but on the willingness to keep choosing it, stood together in the October light and let it be enough.